My name is John Cleveland. I'm the Executive Director of the Green Ribbon Commission, and along with my colleague Amy. Amy, raise your hand there. We staff the commission, which, as most of you know, is a voluntary network of CEOs supporting the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. And we are just really, really delighted to be here this afternoon releasing the Carbon-Free Boston report, which those of you who were early birds got an actual hard copy. That's a limited printing, so you could probably hawk it on eBay pretty quickly. Before we get going, I just want to thank our host, the Museum of Science, who is part of a new working group that we put together of cultural institutions, and they gave us this great space free of charge, so let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. It's a great place. So this is an effort that's been about 2.5 years in the making. As many of you know, in early May of 2016, Mayor Walsh joined his colleagues in the Metro Mayor Coalition and signed something called the Metro Mayor's Climate Mitigation Commitment that committed the city to carbon neutrality by 2050. In May of that year, the mayor sent the Green Ribbon Commission a letter and asked us to put a working group together to help shape a framework for how the city could achieve those goals. We formed a working group. Mindy Luber, the president and CEO of Ceres, was kind enough to agree to chair it. It has 11 members that are up there who put in a lot of hours guiding us in this process. And our first step was to go out and benchmark what other cities have done, what best practice looks like in this area. We talked to countless cities, consultants, energy modelers, et cetera. And in an ironic kind of way, it ended up leading us right back to our backyard in Boston University, whose president is on the Green Ribbon Commission and who serves on the working group. And we ended up connecting with Peter Fox-Penner and Cutler Cleveland, and they sort of guided us through the process of figuring out what would it actually take to get a really sophisticated data-driven modeling platform to help the city make choices. As it turns out, doing that costs real money, and so we ended up having to raise a little over $1 million in project funding. Fortunately, we have a great network of supporters and stakeholders. 13 different organizations, institutions provided the support and allowed us to actually do this work. The analysis process itself was launched in November of 2016, and we have had, I think it's a little over 120 experts involved in 5 different technical advisory groups to provide input. It's worth noting, and we're proud of the fact that we had a very, very explicit focus in this report on social equity and social equity issues from the very beginning, and the report includes analysis on that. And in addition to this summary report that you have, in early March there will be available the full technical report for those of you who are climate geeks and really do want to look at the forecasting algorithms. You'll be able to check that out. Very exciting. And we'll also have a full a much more detailed social equity report that will be available at the same time. And what's going to happen now, and you're going to hear from Chris Cook, who's on our panel shortly, what's happening now is the city's going to take this analytical framework and use it to update their climate action plan and start to develop really explicit 5-year roadmaps for implementation on all of the core strategies. So just quickly in terms of our agenda this morning, first, Cutler Cleveland of Boston University is going to, who served as the principal investigator, is going to do a high-level overview of the findings. Next, we have a great panel. We have 6 people serving on a panel. We have Mindy Luber, CEO and president of Ceres. Gina McCarthy, who many of you know and love. Thank you for coming back to Boston, Gina. As you know, she's been in this field for a really long time. Chris Cook, who's the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space, and the Commissioner of Parks and Recreation for the City of Boston. Pete Hamill, who's VP and General Manager of Turner Construction, also serves on the GRC. Atia Martin, who's the CEO and founder of All ACES and led our social equity analysis, and then Cutler Cleveland himself. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Cutler, who's going to provide a brief overview of the report. Cutler, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everyone, for turning out today. It's great to be here. Great to see some familiar faces, especially great to see some current and former students. Current students, why aren't you in class? That's all right. I'm sure your faculty members would understand. So as John mentioned, I'm the principal investigator for this project, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the important role of my co-principal investigator, Peter Fox-Penner, who's the director of the Institute, and Dr. Michael Walsh, who is the senior technical lead, who, if you were involved in the project, knows who really pulled the train in terms of delivering the technical work. So I led this team at the Institute, about 10 of us overall, and we worked closely with the GRC. Many thanks to John Cleveland and Amy Longsworth for their tremendous work. And we worked with an external group of folks to build these sector-specific models related to mitigation. And we had a steering committee comprised of representatives from the city and the Commonwealth, as well as some of our major funders. And we had technical advisory groups, which John mentioned. And I wanted to really thank those 100 or so people who had deep expertise in buildings, transportation, waste, and energy from the private sector, academia, NGOs, the state, the Commonwealth, who came, volunteered their time to come and take a deep dive into these sectors. And we really couldn't have done it without you. In fact, if anyone is from one of the technical advisory groups, if you wouldn't mind standing up just so we could acknowledge the tremendous work that you did. We have quite a few. Thank you. Wow, that's pretty impressive. And also just want to thank our consultants who did a lot of the heavy lifting from an analytical perspective. Applied Economics Clinic, All ACES, Arup, Cambridge Systematics, and line advisors for community and climate, who helped us with a lot of the important work. So I'm going to give you a high-level view. You have some of you that were able to get the summary report in hard copy. It's online at various places. And as John mentioned, we'll be delivering 2 additional reports later this spring, one a companion report on social equity and one with the technical details. So what we did was to develop a baseline strategy, which assessed what would happen in the city of Boston through 2050 if the city took no additional action from what they're doing now? So looking at trajectories in demographics and economic growth and technology. And we find that there would be a rather significant decline in emissions, largely due to the decarbonization of the New England grid that's ongoing, albeit slowly, and also due to improvements in the efficiency of cars. And so even if the city did nothing, we'd see about, I think, a 15 or 20% drop in GHG emissions. But of course, that is not zero or carbon neutral. So there's a big chunk of work left for the city and its partner to do to achieve carbon neutrality. And that's what we set out to assess. And we came away with the results of our work, identified 3 mutually reinforcing strategies that need to be pursued together. The first and most important is that every energy-using activity has to be done in the most efficient manner feasible. And so this means that every building is a high-performance building. We shift people out of cars into biking, walking, and public transit, and waste diversion is minimized. Secondly, a carbon-neutral system converts systems that currently run on fossil fuels, such as cars burning gasoline and furnaces burning gas, over to electricity to the fullest extent possible. And light and duty medium vehicles need to be fully electrified. And then third, once you've maximized the efficiency, electrify what you can, you have to supply people who live and work and visit the city with GHG-free electricity and fuels. And those are the 3 main takeaways. As John mentioned, with our work with Applied Economics Clinic and All ACES, we developed and applied a social equity framework to ensure that no one in the city of Boston, based on their race, their place, their income, their language, their physical ability, or age is excluded from the opportunities and benefits associated with the transition to a carbon-neutral city. And we applied the framework, general framework that you see here to every one of our strategies that we assessed in the buildings, transportation, energy, and waste sectors. And as I mentioned, there'll be a companion report published in later this spring that will detail those equity considerations. So before I dive into some of the key results, a bit of background. You won't be surprised to hear that fossil fuels dominate life in Boston, just like it does in every other major city, most every other major city in the world. This is information from that we got from the city's greenhouse gas inventory and used in our models. And you can see that greenhouse gas emissions are roughly equally split between electricity, petroleum-based fuels, that's gasoline and diesel fuel, and natural gas. So a couple of key things to note here. The electricity, the greenhouse gas emissions in electricity, they include the electricity that is burned somewhere in New England to generate the electricity that Boston purchases. And right now, the New England grid today is running on about 50% natural gas, and about 30% nuclear, and about 18% renewables, and a smidgeling of coal and oil. So those greenhouse gases embedded in the electricity we purchase, the city is responsible for in their inventory. In regards to petroleum, there are two things to know about that petroleum number, which has to do with the mode of transportation and the geography of transportation in Boston. 2/3 of the emissions in the city's inventory come from private vehicles. So that is a big frame setter for the challenge of mitigating. And a lot of those emissions come from outside of the city. In fact, only 1/4 of the emissions of the trips made within this, in the city's inventory come from trips that start and end in Boston. And indeed, more than half, if you're familiar with the geography of Boston, start from outside of I-95. And so the people moving in and out of the city for work or for recreation are a big contributor to the city's greenhouse gas emissions. And that's important because, as we'll see, there's limited opportunity to move those folks out of cars into public transportation. The other important piece of information is what sectors the greenhouse gases are generated in. And you can see that buildings are the lion's share of emissions. Nearly 2/3 of emissions come from buildings, another 20% or so from on-road transportation, and about 6% from waste. So you can see right away that buildings have to be at the centerpiece of building moving to a carbon-neutral city, because they account for the lion's share of emissions. Now I'm going to tell you three stories here about three of the main sectors in the city that generate emissions, and I'm going to do so in the following way. I'm going to show you a baseline scenario, which indicates what we think emissions would do without any new action by the city, and then look at what the city can do, various strategies that they could implement, and also the impacts of what state law, particularly the Clean Energy Standard, which is going to drive the decarbonization of electricity in Massachusetts, and then what the city can do in terms of procuring clean energy, and look at how those various combinations of actions, some the city can take, some which the Commonwealth is going to take, and some which they're going to have to take together, gets us towards neutrality. So here's the baseline in buildings. The BPDA forecasts that we're going to add about 100 million square feet of building space between now and 2050, which of course will increase consumption. But we expect, we built into our model some assumptions that the state energy code will become more efficient over time. So those two roughly balance out. So without any new action by the city, emissions will be roughly constant. We then assessed three strategies that the city could undertake. One is in regards to new buildings, and we assumed that sometime in the not too distant future, every new building built in the city is a net zero building. And so it's on net, releasing no net GHGs. Secondly, we assume that every building in the city that's currently built undergoes a deep energy retrofit. This is on the order of 80 to 85,000 buildings to improve their energy efficiency and reduce their energy use. And if you do those two things, you can see the drop in greenhouse gas emissions produced by that. Then you go to electrification. So now we swap up as many furnaces that burn natural gas as possible, and switch in electric boilers and air source heat pumps. And notice with the current grid, you only get a tiny bump because there's still a lot of greenhouse gases in the electricity grid, and you're using a lot more electricity because you electrify everything. But now, if you implement the state clean energy standard, right? So the Commonwealth is doing a lot of heavy lifting for the city here. You get a large reduction in greenhouse gases where now the power of efficiency combined with thermal electrification is realized. If the city then goes out and procures enough electricity to remove in an accounting way that the greenhouse gases left in the grid, you can remove another chunk of emissions. And you are left with a small amount of emissions which are in buildings that are very hard to electrify and to remove greenhouse gases, and also emergency backup systems for hospitals and so on. Transportation. Here's the baseline. Looks different because here we assume that federal fuel efficiency standards will do what they're supposed to do by law, which, of course, is an open-ended issue at this point. But if cars do become more efficient in the way in which they could be and in which they currently are set to be, you'll get a big reduction in emissions just from that alone. We then looked at a set of policies and strategies that the city could implement to reduce the demand for travel and personal vehicles. And this comes in two principal ways. One is mode shift, getting people out of cars to biking, walking, and transit, and also reducing the demand for trips. So in terms of mode shift, we looked at building out a lot of the infrastructure proposed in Go Boston 2030. This is 250 miles of protected bike facilities, 42 new miles of rapid bus, and 35 new miles of urban rail. Lower cost transit. We looked at making, if you walk to a T-stop or a bus stop, it's free. If you drive to a subway or commuter rail stop, you get you pay half the fare. And we also looked at a variety of private vehicle pricing schemes, including a congestion fee, a parking fee, and a VMT fee. We also addressed the issue of ride hailing, which is a challenge that every major city is now facing. And we looked at a $1 per mile fee on someone who rides alone in an Uber and Lyft, which would be returned as a cross-subsidy to Uber and Lyft that had 3 or more people in it. So you get more people into these shared vehicles and improve the energy efficiency. And if the city did all that, easy, right? You get the reduction there. Then if you simply take the next step, which is then take every light and medium duty vehicle that travels in the city and electrify it, every single one, you get a significant bump even with the current grid because electric vehicles are 3 times more energy efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. Then you can ride the grid with the state's clean energy standard, you get the bump, and then the city can procure additional energy, and you're still with some residual emissions, largely in large, heavy trucks that are going to be difficult to electrify. The last sector we looked at was waste, and it currently accounts for about 6% of the city's emissions. That first bar there shows the amount of emissions, largely from combustion of waste. The city sends most of its waste that it doesn't recycle to combustion facilities where it's used to generate electricity. It currently recycles about 25% of its waste, 75% is diverted. The Zero Waste Boston plan, which I think the advisory committee is soon to send their recommendations to Mayor Walsh, essentially is going to flip the waste system so that upwards of 80 or 90% of waste is going to be diverted through increased recycling, composting, and source reduction. And we looked at the greenhouse gas implications of that. And what you can see is that with increased recycling and source reduction and so on, you can reduce emissions by almost 90%, just by enacting what Zero Waste Boston has proposed to do. There still is going to be some residual emissions associated with some things that are very challenging to recycle. Last chart. I can't help it, I'm a professor. Here's how this all rolls up together for the city as a whole, taking all the sectors combined. You have the current emissions and the path to 2050. So that top line is all the baseline scenarios plus what the state is going to do with the clean energy standard. And so you get a big decline with business as usual and what the state does. And then if you take all those strategies across transportation, buildings, and waste and implemented them, you get that big drop there. So that's action that the city can affect. And then there's that procurement again. And then you're still left with the residual. And we're left with about 11% relative to what we consume today, left in largely gas and some oil that's going to be challenging to eliminate, in which the city, we close our, one of the chapters in our report talks about how that 11% could be used with carbon offsets, which have to be done very carefully to make sure that they're verified and additional, and you have a rigorous third party helping you choose those. Key takeaways, going back to those 3 pillars: maximize efficiency, then you electrify activities to the extent that you can, and then you procure clean energy for every resident and business in Boston. And these are, it's important to understand that these are essential, mutually reinforcing, and long-term. And they have to start now. And you can't wait, you can't do them in sequence, and you can't mix and match. It's full bore on all 3 pillars. The second major takeaway is that most of these technologies and strategies exist now. We don't have to wait for something to fall out of the sky like manna from heaven to save us. Most of these technologies exist right now, and Boston's already, in many of their programs in energy efficiency and Billington and so on, is already doing this. So they're already moving in this direction. And finally, carbon neutrality delivers a lot of benefits other than greenhouse gas reduction. For example, compared to business as usual, the utility bill in the city of Boston for everyone who pays for gas and electricity is $600 million lower. $600 million lower compared to a business as usual scenario. Thousands of new jobs will be created. Think of all those retrofits. We're talking about 2,000 retrofits a year, which really has tremendous workforce development opportunities. People will be a lot healthier. Gina knows this. She's worked on this stuff her whole life. Transportation, harmful air pollutants such as NOx and particulate matter dropped by 29% and 55% respectively. Energy efficient buildings are healthier due to less mold and less infiltration. Walking and biking improve cardiovascular fitness. And we also find that driving in the city, the amount of trips made in the city will drop by 1/3 in vehicles, which will make the city safer, quieter, and less congested. And of course, it goes without saying that intentional planning, as I mentioned at the outset, is needed to ensure that everyone in Boston, regardless of race or income or language or culture, has the ability to, if not unduly burdened by the costs associated with this, and also have the opportunity to benefit from the transition to a carbon neutral city. Thanks.
So the professor just gave you the cliff notes to the 109-page report. If our great panelists could come and seat themselves, we'll get the panel part of the session started. Great. So Mindy, I'm going to start with you. So, you know, your organization, we're so fortunate to have this incredible international NGO located here in Boston. Mindy willing to spend her time on this. You've been a global leader in organizing the large institutional investors and corporations to take action on climate change. So how do you see the city of Boston's leadership fitting into this global context? And how important is it for a city like Boston to step out on this issue?
How's that for an easy question? Thank you, John, and fun to be here and see so many friends of the last 30, 40 years in this community, in this world. If we look at last week's World Economic Forum, and I'm going to bring it right back to Boston, 7 out of 10 of the greatest global threats identified by world leaders, corporate leaders, financial leaders, and political leaders, 7 out of 10 were climate related. You know, climate and resilience, climate and adaptation, water. I mean, I've never seen that. You know, we've seen climate mentioned once, mentioned twice, but 7 out of 10. And the second thing that's relevant, which again I will tie back to Boston, is that the report said we are sleepwalking into catastrophe. That we know how bad the problem is, and somehow, whether it's a psychology block or reality block, we are not doing what it takes. And part of that is explained by It's so big we don't know where to go. It's so big we can't get our hands around it. There are no real steps. So if I can't be responsible, I'd rather ignore it, whether you're an individual, a business leader, a philanthropic leader, or whatever. What this report, what makes this so compelling, although I will say 110-page summary, that, is an academic. Summaries to me are 5 pages, 8 pages, 110. What this 110-page summary tells us and does is that it's doable. It shows an extraordinary sobering problem. Absolutely none of us individually know what to do to get our hands around it, but the great thing about this report is that it tells us what it takes to get there. And we will follow up this report by what are the mechanics then? Okay, if it's retrofitting all of these old buildings, our next step at the Green Ribbon Commission or in every room you're all in is how do we finance it? What does it look like? How do we get there? Where does the money come from? What it does is take a problem that seems so out of control, so incomprehensible, so almost unbelievable, or the overused word that we're all seeing now is existential, the existential threat of climate. Nobody knows exactly how to even get their hands around that, given that word, is that there's this impediment to action. So we can take this report, I think all of us, as we go back to state politics, as I go back to working with large companies and investors around the world, and say, let's do what the city of Boston did. Let's look at what we have the capacity to do, whatever constituency is. Let's break it down, and let's figure out how to get there. The reality is there is a will. We've got to provide some of the tools, and you did a great job at providing those tools. So let's have at it.
Thank you, Mindy. Really appreciate that. Gina, you've been working on environmental protection for many, many decades, including a stint as...
Don't say that many, many.
many decades. I don't know. That's right.
It's true, though. Go
Yes, yes. Including leading the EPA and really being the champion that drove the Clean Power Plan, which I believe is still in force despite
it is.
efforts to extract it.
It's just not being implemented.
Yeah, and now you're working to highlight the connection between climate and public health at Harvard. 2 questions for you. One, given the lack of leadership at the federal level, what kind of role can cities like Boston play? We're a small amount of global emissions and a small amount of U.S. emissions, but can you say a little bit about how important it is for us to move, and where can we have the most impact doing this work? And I want to ask you a follow-up question on public health connections.
Well, first of all, congratulations and thank you for all the work on this, and I want to thank the mayor. As a person who lives in this city, I couldn't be more proud. I'm glad for the leadership. But let me answer your question. I know that everybody snickered, and I never want to hear it again when they said fuel economy standards. There's no snickering. Go, ooh, don't snicker. We don't like the fact that they're up for grabs. But one of the things that's most important for you to remember is that those things haven't gone away yet. So let's keep fighting. But I think the most important message really is that when the federal government falls asleep, it's up to the rest of us to wake up. And that's exactly what you're seeing in this country today. And not just because of the work that Mindy does to try to get the business and investment community to step up, but it's really about other parts of the government. It's about state government, it's about local government. And Massachusetts is a great example of where there's tremendous movement and synergy in both the state and the city level. And Boston's important. I'll tell you why it's important is that mayors are kind of where it's at. They're the ones that actually can set the pace. They can get people engaged. They can break that syndrome that Mindy mentioned, which is everybody thinks climate change is too big to anybody to do anything about, and it's all about polar bears. Well, it really isn't. Polar bears are cool, but not in Boston. It's all about us. It's all about our kids. It's all about us being able to take action ourselves. And if you've been in the environment or public health arena for many, many, many decades, as I have, at a many, it really has always been about grassroots driving change up. It has never been the federal government sitting and contemplating their navel and thinking a good thing that no one's ever thought about before. So it's hugely important at a time when the federal government is asleep that cities take action, that they engage people, they give them hope, they give them a sense that they can chart their own destiny, and they show them that there are solutions that aren't just good for the environment, but will keep their kids healthy and safe. Give the next generation a fighting chance to do better than what we were handed and where we ended up, and give them a sense that they can do that not by sacrifice, but by moving towards a world that is more sustainable, cleaner, healthier, and that we can all believe is more just than the one we have today. That's what this plan is about. That's what cities can do. That's what we have to demand that they all do right now at a time when national leadership is simply not there.
I want to follow up on your last comment. So how do you see the connection between climate change and public health? And are there practical ways as a city goes about its implementation that we can make this connection more clear?
Well, John, I do think there are, and I think that I have always felt that I actually wasn't in the environmental protection business. I was really in the public health protection business, because at EPA we care about delivering clean air and clean water and land that is safe to live in, and places to go for your kids to play and to go to school that are healthy for them. That's the job that I have always been engaged in. And it's not that I don't love birds and bunnies, but I do. I mean, I want them to be around, but it's fundamentally about what we need to live and how we live sustainably in the world. And to me, the connection between climate and public health has been a direct one, not an indirect one. And the clearest example you can give is air pollution. You know, we now know across the world that about 9 million people at least die directly as a result of pollution exposure. 9 million every single year. 7 million of those are from direct exposure to air pollution. And we have spent decades arguing about whether climate change is real, which thankfully very few are arguing about anymore. But think, if we just said, why don't you fix your air pollution problem? What you would have had is a serious reduction in fossil fuel burning that would have resulted in tremendous opportunities to actually hold climate in check. And we have to think about this not as a problem for the planet, but as a challenge for ourselves and our kids today. Because pollution is not an equal opportunity killer. It goes after the most vulnerable. It goes after our kids. It goes after the elderly. It goes after low-income communities where we need to focus the benefits the most. So if you wonder why a mayor wants to save the planet, it's because if mayors don't, the United States government isn't doing it today. And secondly, they're doing it for the health and welfare and benefit and safety of their own communities, of the families that live in this city. That's who benefits first and foremost. So if you think about this, John, I would really encourage you as you're looking at options, because this is a menu of wonderful solutions that should give everybody hope that we can make this happen. But the best thing about it is choose wisely. Choose where you get the maximum health benefits today so that people can see the immediate benefits of climate action. Then we can work with other countries to show them that they don't have to go the same path we did. They can choose the healthier choice today, and it will give them a lovely, more sustainable and just future. That's what we need to go for.
Great, thank you. Chris, you're where the rubber is going to meet the road here. And first, I just want to thank you and your team, you, Allison, Carl, Lauren. We just couldn't have done this without you. You were the customer for this report, but there was a lot of co-production.
Actually, could all the
happened.
City of Boston staff just
Yeah,
raise
that'd be
their hands
great.
so you could give
Yeah.
them a round of applause?
Yeah, sweet.
Thank you.
So, as we noted at the beginning, this report is an analytical platform, not an implementation plan. Can you just say a little bit about what the city's process is going to be to turn this into an implementation strategy?
So it's very exciting. I don't know if this is the official handover or the official handover takes place in like a private ceremony somewhere. But I believe we're receiving this report. And that's gonna launch our climate action plan update. And that is the process by which we make those well-informed choices and that we connect them to the ones that have the most public health benefit today, but are also the most equitable, especially in consideration of our socially vulnerable populations. And so there's a whole menu, there's a suite of options that we can select from, but the climate action plan is really the way in which we're gonna need the public input to create these rules and engage in the procedures that'll actually lead us to carbon neutrality. The important part about this climate action plan update is I think we're uniquely positioned, and we're enormously in the debt of the Green Ribbon Commission and also Boston University for giving us this roadmap, is that we're buoyed by this information as we make these decisions. And so it's within a context that we can move with urgency, but we can also go through an equity framework and really make sure that we're making the most balanced decisions that benefit the most of our population possible. So our climate action plan should take about 6 or 8 months, and there's going to be massive public outreach during it, and we would encourage all of you not only to support it, but also to really engage on it and really push for what you want to see in that plan. At the end of that, the result will have to be benchmarks. And frankly, the city has to be held accountable. And in Boston, politicians are held accountable, and the people who work for politicians are held accountable. Speaking of politicians, I just want to thank Councilor O'Malley for joining us. He's the co-chair of the Environment Committee for the Boston City Council. And those metrics that we measure are going to have to be meaningful in 2 ways. One, did we actually achieve them? So did we actually reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? And did we do so through some socially equitable framework? But also, where does that get us for the next round, and what are we building towards? And are the metrics that we're measuring things that are meaningful to all the organizations and to all the people who are represented in this audience? One last thing, if it's okay, where the rubber hits the road is really with the youth of our city, as Gina mentioned earlier. So through this position, and again, I have to give a lot of thanks to my predecessors, both Brian Sweat and Austin Blackman. I've been blessed to be meeting with students, and both of those individuals really encouraged me to meet with as many young people as possible. What's startling to me, and perhaps it shouldn't be, is just how well versed young people are on the issue of climate change and on carbon neutrality. The generation that's coming up is quite frankly mad as hell, and they want the world to change because they see what we've done to it. And they want to make sure that there's measurable difference in this upcoming version of Boston that they're going to be receiving. And so I think we really need to engage with them in a very deliberate way and make sure that they're helping inform the decisions, because ultimately, our climate action plan will be implemented. There'll be 3 or 5 years worth of work. And then those young people are going to be in decision-making positions to take on the next climate action plan. We want to leave them in a place where they can actually pick up the ball and really run with it, as opposed to, setting them back yet again. So I think we have to be very, very intentional about how we engage with young people moving forward.
Great, thanks, Chris. Pete, your company, Turner Construction, is one of the biggest construction management companies in the country. So you're in there sort of figuring this out in the really nitty-gritty way on a day-to-day basis. And as you heard Cutler say, buildings are 75% of the emissions. We've got to do deep retrofits, electrify our heating, procure renewable energy. 86,000 buildings, 630 million square feet. Not a trivial task. So. No problem. Yeah. So as you think about that, what kind of thoughts and reflections do you have on the challenges that confront your industry in getting to this end game?
To start, I guess, for us as an industry, we've just, and we lag a little bit compared to many industries, we've just come to appreciate what resiliency actually means and what climate change actually means to us as an industry. 5 years ago, if you talked about climate change, you talked about it twice a year, maybe 4 times a year if you're really good. Over the last year and a half, we as an industry have changed that. We talk about it 4 times a week, which is really good, but we're not talking about sustainability. So if you look at, again, resiliency as an organization, we're the largest builder in the country. In 2018, finally in 2018, and a lot of it comes from Boston and the Green Ribbon Commission and the city of Boston and what we've done over the last 10 years, we've now come to appreciate that we need specific people to manage climate change within an organization, dedicated teams across the country just focused on just that, climate change, sustainability, resiliency. Primarily today, resiliency, which is a shame. Resiliency takes care of the next 50 years, but it doesn't take care of the second half of this century or the century thereafter. So if I look at our industry and as you just said, 86,000 buildings and you know, about 1/3 of that population, that building stock will be built this century if you forecast out to 2050. That means, you know, and that's sort of the good news. Not so good news is there's 2/3 of that building stock, that 86,000, that was built prior to this century. And if you really look at the numbers, I think it's about half of that building stock was built prior to 1950. That's when, you know, there was no performance glass. There was little insulation in the walls. You know, the way we built the buildings back then is exponentially less than what we do today. So if I look, you know, if I look forward and I look at, you know, Cutler, the work that you and the team have done over the last couple of years developing this report, I'm humbled as a builder, and I thought we had it fixed by focusing on resiliency, and I was so wrong, very much so wrong. So as I look forward, off of, you know, the analytical components of what you guys put together over the last year, I say first we've got to educate my design partners, my development partners, and my building partners. I'm not an anomaly. I think I'm actually better than most. And again, I'm humbled by what I experienced this weekend. So first thing, educate our population. Second is deep dive. Just like we did with sea level rise. We looked at the barrier solution, we looked at onshore opportunities, and we landed with onshore. We got to do the same thing here. I have no idea what deep retrofit means. All I know is we've got to now do that to 2/3 of our population of building stock. No idea. And I've got to do it, I think, between now and 2045, or is it 2030? I forget. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Get on it. What are you doing here anyway?
Get on it. So what does that mean to hospitals and single residents and office towers that were built in 1950 that are 28 stories and, you know, filled with a bunch of lawyers? How do you do that? Logistically, I think the technology, and you said it, Color, the technology exists. It's logistically, how do you do that with the occupants within the building without evacuating the city? It's a challenge. How do we transfer, you know, about 50% of our thermal load is generated by natural gas or gas, fossil fuels. There will be a time when we will flip to a clean grid. It's just, how do you do that? What design parameters do you put in place so that 10 or 8 or 5 or 10 years from now, you can actually make that transition and do it in a healthy way? You know, again, I think code and policy has to push along some of this, and I think we've got to act relatively soon with that as a catalyst for folks like us in our industry. I guess I would summarize by saying, you know, again, I walked a week ago, and walking into the weekend, I thought I was all set with resiliency being the game. And as I walked through the weekend and experienced sustainability and what it really means, for me, I thought, you know, sustainability and taking the road that we've sort of been on for the last 15 years as designers and builders was good enough. And also personally taking the plastic bottle and putting it in the right trash can. That's what I thought my role was. Not anymore, which is a great thing for me, and it's now my role to change our city, change our globe, because it's about the next 100 years, not the next 50 years when it comes to sustainability.
Great.
you. We just are really lucky to have you on our team, man. That's great. Atia. Hello. You led, as the Chief Resilience Officer, you led the city's efforts to address racial inequities, and you led our Crossing Carbon-Free Boston team's efforts to integrate analysis of social equity into the report. Where do you see the biggest opportunities to improve social equity as the city goes about building an implementation strategy?
Thank you so much. So first I want to say that I am so honored and proud to be a part of the team that was kind of going through the difficulty of iron sharpening iron and kind of debating over the issues and then coming together to figure out, now that we have worked through the challenges, how do we collectively share with folks the results of that hard work. And so thank you to the mayor's office and the mayor for writing that letter, and thank you to the Green Ribbon Commission for taking that charge on. And so as part of the team, what I want to say is, in terms of the big idea before I get there, is that we've been talking about social equity, right, in a very intellectual way. And so I want to remind us that as we think about social equity, there's a reason we need it, right? We need social equity because we have a long history of policies, practices, and culture that have led to these perverse outcomes in vulnerable communities and communities of color, in poor communities, and all of the different populations everyone has been talking about. And so as we look to make investments to move us forward in addressing greenhouse gas emissions, that we also have this opportunity to be conscious about the historical context of why communities are struggling the way they're struggling, and those conscious decisions that we made, and some of them not so conscious because we didn't have the tools and foresight, and sometimes not the right people in the room to really look at what later are called unintended consequences, that had we done that analysis ahead of time, we could have predicted that the people who are most vulnerable are going to suffer the most, and that if we are not intentional, they're going to be left out of the benefits of these strategies that we do, or these policies that we put together collectively in our society. So with that said, from a social equity perspective, the biggest opportunity that we have here is to address one of the biggest challenges we have in this country, which is the wealth gap. So there's the wealth gap in general, right, within the haves and have-nots, and we've seen the decline of the middle class and the growth of the folks who are working poor and folks who have lots of money, more money than we can ever fathom, right? And so as we look at the wealth gap, we also see what's already been mentioned as these opportunities from not just a workforce development perspective, but also an entrepreneurial perspective, right? In order to take advantage of those opportunities, we have to create the pathways to prepare people and small businesses, especially our MWBE businesses, our women-owned businesses, to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. Because what we've discussed previously is that we currently don't have the workforce to do this right now, to do all of that stuff that we've been talking about. And so this is an amazing opportunity for the city in its the action planning to be able to embed all of this in there to make sure that all of us in Boston have access to what we need to thrive, what we need to benefit from all of this work, but also that we are very intentional about it. It took a lot of intentionality for us to get here, and it's going to take more for us to address the social equity challenges that we have. And then the last point I'll make is that there's been a lot of amazing points around the huge elephant of climate change, right? And how much fear we have of taking it on because it's not clear what our individual and collective roles are, and the benefit of this report helping us with that. The other layer on top of that complicates it is that we have the same perspective on equity issues, right? Where it seems so big, it seems so complicated, and how do you do it? Well, this is an opportunity for us to actually embed that intentionality in order to show people this is how you do it in practical ways. It's not a theoretical or intellectual exercise. Like, we could actually do this. We could actually do it well, and I'm excited to be a part of the team to kind of help think through that piece.
Great, thanks Atia. Cutler, I guess the professor always gets the last word. I'm just curious, as you did this work, which we think is the most sophisticated analysis that's been done by any U.S. study, what surprised you?
That's a good question. Can I be a little wonkish? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
As long as it's short wonkish.
Okay, that's hard. So I've been teaching about energy and sustainability before we even knew what sustainability was. And this work has fundamentally changed part of my narrative that I now have to weave into my teaching. And here's the narrative that many people have kind of believed for a long time. Since the mid-19th century, when humanity shifted from a wood-based agrarian economy to a fossil fuel-based industrial economy, we have assumed that economic prosperity and human well-being moves in lockstep with using more energy, particularly fossil fuels. And historically, that's been the case. More people, more GDP, more energy use. So here's what our research has shown, and just contemplate these numbers if you can. So in 2050, there's going to be 100,000 more people in Boston. We'll add at least 100 million more square feet of building space. Economic output will move from about $116 billion that it is today, well north of $200 billion. In our analysis in 2050, we will use 82% less fossil fuel and only 12% more electricity. That is absolutely a mind-boggling result. And I think we're the first city to kind of show with reasonable assumptions. There's heavy lifting to be done, but with very reasonable assumptions and mostly available technology, that we can essentially decouple human well-being from significant increases in the use of energy, particularly those forms of energy which damage the environment and human health.
Great, thank you. Well, let's give our panel a round of applause. Great, thank you all. So we now have time for audience questions. So if you do want to ask a question, there's a microphone there and a microphone there. So just line up and we'll see who wants to answer them.
My name is Marilyn Smith. I'm working with Gas Leaks Allies, a group of 20-something organizations. We started on going after gas leaks, and then because they emit methane, and then we're working on no more gas infrastructure. And the real concern I have is that I think you said 50% of the electricity is coming from natural gas, and a huge amount of the heating of the homes that you're talking about come from natural gas. And we're working on a path to come up with new systems for heating and electricity besides natural gas, but I'd like to hear what your ideas are on this, because to me that's at the heart of what it is that we need to do.
Cutler, you want to
Sure.
grab that?
So it's a very good question, and it's perhaps the most challenging single issue that we face in decarbonization, and that is swapping out natural gas that's used to heat space, water, and food with electricity. And for many types of buildings, and especially smaller buildings, we can do that right now with air source heat pumps and electric boilers. For larger, older buildings, it's actually quite complex, and you've talked about some of these issues. And so, but we, in our assessment, and our consultants from Arup who took a very deep dive in this, indicate that we can get rid of most, but not all the natural gas right now. And I think that the important point is that you start doing it now, and then in 10 or 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, there are going to be more technology and advances which will enable some of those tougher retrofits to be had.
Hi, my name's Colby. I'm a research intern with Climbable. This is kind of directed towards the whole panel, but Gina, you brought this up of disinterest and kind of navel gazing about climate issues at the federal level. I worry a bit about beyond disinterest, flat out disinformation, and I'm wondering from the entire panel, sort of what an approach to combating disinformation might be.
Wow, that is a big question. I will tell you, I don't worry about it. I'm really ticked off about it. I mean, because what you see right now at the federal level is not just a bunch of incorrect facts. But there has definitely been a concerted effort, very similar to the tobacco campaign, to put climate science in disrepute and to attack climate scientists. And right now you will see beyond that at the federal level, we have an attack on science itself. So we've gone even well beyond questioning climate change. But I guess the one hopeful sign, well, there are many actually, but the most important hopeful sign is that people are getting it, regardless of the campaign that's been lodged to discredit climate science. They know that the climate is changing. There is, and that's up to 3/4 of the people in the United States. That's a lot. You never get to 100%. And it's my belief that we need to work with those 3/4 and take action instead of debating with the quarter that won't talk to us. So I'm not attempting anymore to argue about whether the climate has changed. I'm attempting to tell people that indeed it has, and the choice really is, what solutions do you want to pick? That's why reports like this are important. It's not a debate of things we already know. It's a question of how do we begin to look more carefully at the solutions that are on hand and to send the absolute right signals that government's supposed to send about what are we looking for next? What does innovation bring? Because I was really interested in your answer, which was terrific. But in 20 years, I'll guarantee you, we won't be choosing the same solutions, because once you send a signal, business innovation happens. Private sector starts delivering on it. So I'm not just going to base my belief that we'll get through this on what's available to us today. If we start using what's available to us today, the future will be endless in terms of the solutions, the solution set we'll have. That's what we got to keep doing. So I just don't argue about it anymore. It's not worth it. It's silly. It wastes time. It demoralizes us, and it takes away our hope. Act is where we are.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that and tell you that walk outdoors. I mean, I've been in South Boston for 21 years, building most of South Boston, and I've seen the water crest over the wall 3 times along Seaport Boulevard. Once was in 1999, and twice in the past year. So, and if I talk to my colleagues across the country, they've got the same stories. So, the design community, the developers, institutions are all demanding that we as builders bring this forward. It's there. It's live.
And I'll just add something very quickly, which is the idea of propaganda, right? And so part of it is that we as consumers, and particularly those of us that understand what is happening, have a responsibility to make sure that we're helping other people understand where that disinformation is happening and where to get the facts. And the idea of us using our critical thinking skills not to take things that are given to us on face value at a blush because it's part of a network that we're comfortable with, but that we actually swim upstream and figure out what is the reliability of this source, right? Where are there other people saying something similar? Because if you get something that this only one person or one organization is saying it, then where is this coming from? What is the root source of the information? And how does it connect to the folks who are on the ground doing this work and what their understanding of the issues are? And I know everyone doesn't have the privilege to be able to take all of those steps. So it's up to folks like us who kind of recognize that this is happening to help other folks understand how the places to get this other access to information that is of better quality and reliability.
Could I just add one more thing? In looking at what sort of makes people take action, is there's a couple of things. Is clearly you need to know what's happening, and you need to know available solutions. What we have learned is that messaging matters and who gives the message matters. And so one of the most important things about locally driven action is, number one, you can figure out what matters to people. I talk about health because health is what's driven every environmental improvement I know. It's when, you know, when you're threatened, when your kid's future is at stake, you take action. But the second thing is, it's the messenger that matters. You know, we're doing work at my little center called Sea Change at Harvard to teach doctors and nurses, the healthcare professionals, to stop just talking about healthcare and start talking to their patients about things that drive health outcomes, which is public health, which is climate change. We're talking to faith leaders to talk, because everybody has someone they trust. That's the best place to get your information. If we can get the information into the hands of those human beings that people care about and trust and will listen to, then they'll maybe turn off the television set and have the kind of conversations we need to make climate change not something you don't talk about in mixed company, but simply facts that we need to deal with.
Let me add one final point, and that is 10 years ago, it was harder to make the case. Unlike air pollution, water pollution, certain things that you could see and smell and taste right in front of you, greenhouse gas emissions are different. On top of that, what they do in Rio de Janeiro impacts Boston. What they do in Singapore impacts Brazil. We now have the reality. It may be that we couldn't touch it or feel it, although we knew it and the science was telling us. We now see it. We see it. We saw it in Houston. We saw it in Puerto Rico. Just in one hurricane season, we saw 3 over-the-top storms. The forest fires that were complicated and made far more severe in Northern California, where one of the major and most renewable inclined public utility companies, PG&E, declared bankruptcy today. $18 billion company, $18 billion with $30 billion in debt, due to the kind of damage we see from climate-related implications. So now is the time. Nobody could say they don't believe it, they don't buy it, they're seeing it, they're feeling it, we are experiencing it day after day. I just mentioned the United States. Around the world, it is happening every day. So it is time to act. The world does believe it. There was a full-page ad in the Washington Post last week trying to recomplicate the science. You know, on the one hand, on the other hand, let's look at both sides. That ad is there for a reason, because they're on the run, because we have made the case. People believe it. It is time for everyone in this room to go out and, as Gina said, to act and to talk about it. And on top of that, we have got to get this issue out of the ghetto of only Democrats care or only progressives on the coast care. I agree with Gina. Let's not talk to the people who absolutely aren't interested in science or truth. But there are lots of people who understand and need to understand what that means to their lives, to their kids, to their families. And it takes dinner table conversation and neighborly conversations. We all need to leave here having those conversations. There is no parent in the world who would let a bus come at their kids and not jump in front of that bus to stop things and to change it. Climate change is that bus, and we need to make sure we all understand it. And we can do that. We are now in the front of the game instead of trailing along.
So I think we probably, unfortunately, just have time for like 2 more questions. So one over on this side, and then we'll move back to this side.
Hi, my name's Elliot Laffer, and for over 40 years as a member of Neighborhood Association Back Bay, I've been involved in review of large building projects. And the question of the energy source for those projects is always part of the review. The energy source seems to not change. And that includes projects that are being reviewed right now. In the last year, we've looked at, I think, 4 major projects right around Back Bay, and every one, its major source of energy is natural gas. Why do we let that happen? If it's so important to not use natural gas, then the city should just say, we're not going to approve your project if you don't use if you use natural gas, and end it. And in the absence of that end, all we do is keep looking at how we can reduce the energy use so they use less natural gas. But I thought it was to use none.
So the answer, so it's like the Smith song, "How Soon Is Now," right? So you know, now is the goal, and what does now mean? We can't have fossil fuels coming into our city in 2050 if we're going to be carbon neutral. Any building that gets built with that infrastructure in it is a building that will have to be retrofit later. So we are adding to the pile of work to do for future generations. Again, you know, that check or the balance that we're giving to our kids. And so we have to engage in a very, very urgent but thoughtful discussion about how we build these buildings, to some of the earlier points that were made of how do we reap the benefits, the economic value of these versus the very real concerns of our carbon neutrality goals. A few things on that. Article 37 has to change, and there's an opportunity to do that through the Climate Action Plan. BERDO can be expanded through the Climate Action Plan. That's something that has to be done. And also the Environment Department, you know, with its, you know, there's, I think the entire Environment Department is here, so you see the full force of the Environment Department, and many of them have other duties besides just building review, but we have to be even more thoughtfully engaged than we already are in some of the reviews of that, and we do have partners at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. Education is a big key component to this. What is interesting to me is Cutler's the mental hitching post of this problem is not a us versus them on economic mobility or economic opportunity. It's figuring out how to connect it to the economic opportunity, because then the potential is really unlimited. When you look around the globe, I think it's like 8 of the 10 mega cities in the world are all coastal cities that are vulnerable to sea level rise. These are all cities that are driving the GDP for their country. It's New York in our case, and obviously for the region of New England, it's Boston. They're driving the GDP. They're all vulnerable to climate change, and they need climate adaptation to deal with that. So there's an ethical obligation, but there's also a huge business opportunity to figure out how to build these same buildings clean, get clean energy into the buildings. And so the answer is we have to start doing it. The how we do it, because we can't just do things to people, we have to do things for people and with people. The how we do it is the big question for the Climate Action Plan, but how soon is now? Now.
Last question.
Thank you. Jeffrey Ferris of Jamaica Plain and Ferris Wheels Bicycle Shop for 36 years, promoting bikes in our city. So my comment is around personal responsibility and how much that's a part of your plan. It's sort of mentioned in some of what you're talking about. I'm glad you talked about bikes being a part of the transportation infrastructure. But so much people think about policy, the miles per gallon, your buildings, all of which are important, but things everybody can choose to do individually. Myself as an example. I rode my bike here today. There's so much biking you can do in Boston. I've been riding a bike in Boston since 1973. To me, it's always been a bikeable city. Everything's a short distance away. And for a lot of people, it's not about what you can't do on a bike. Think about what you can do. 2, your home thermostat, the residential heating. You look up so many recommendations about, turn it down to 68 at night. 68, I don't turn it up to 68 in the daytime. Now, I don't expect all you do what we do in my house. Now, Rick here is 60 to 64. Our house is rarely above 60. I have no objection to putting on as many clothes as I need to stay warm. I don't like being cold, but, a jacket and a sweater is cheaper and more environmentally efficient than turning up the thermostat. And there's sort of a equal justice kind of thing that goes with this. I mean, it's sort of like insulting to tell somebody, a poor person, to put on a sweater when their house is cold. But some of it's got to get turned around in a manner that it's okay to put a sweater on and it's environmentally sensible. And I call everybody, take your low temperature challenge, turn it down a little bit, see how low you can keep your temperature. The third one is choosing where you live. All those people driving miles and miles and miles in and out of Boston every day. I mean, I live in Jamaica Plain. My wife works downtown. I work in JP. We have a lifestyle designed to not require a big transportation. So personal responsibility being part of the overall plan, being an important part, along with all the other things. Not to take them out, but that's it.
Thank you. Great note to end on.
Can I add one thing to that? I'm sorry. I can't help myself. I apologize in advance. Just as we think about our individual responsibilities and the context and the way we frame things, that we also consider how to do it in a way that respects the realities of people's lives in the city and outside the city. So we have a lot of our families who want to live in the city who are being forced out of the city and have to commute in. And so how do we leverage these opportunities to kind of have a robust conversation about individual responsibility, about policies, about community collective action, and how all of those things intersect to do exactly what you're talking about, which is this individual, supporting also this individual responsibility aspect, and that we consider all the challenges that some of us face in being able to do some of the things that you discussed, but recognizing those of us that can do it should be doing it.
So, John, if I could just add to that, there is no question that individuals matter. We all need to do things, stop eating meat. There are a dozen things. The scale and the scope of this problem, though, demands everything. It demands individual action, but we can't make this happen without city mandates, and I mean mandates, and I mean now, and I know it's hard, without mandates from the state, without mandates from the federal, nothing good is easy from the federal government. We want a level playing field. You don't want the largest companies, the best individuals doing something that's right and others trailing along. If we are going to get to the scale and the scope of the problem at the pace we need, which is now, we got 12 years to get this under control, according to all the science. We've got to do it all. So yes, individuals, but as individuals, we also have to stand up and fight for city policy and state policy, and eventually, when sanity comes back, federal policy as well. So we need to do it all.
Great. Thank you, Mindy. We do want to encourage you to use your social media outlets to get a word out. Use the hashtag CarbonFreeBoston. There are a bunch of suggested Twitter handles here. So the more we can move this out, this report is now on the Green Ribbon Commission website, and I believe it's also on the city website. So use your systems to push this out. One last round of applause for this great panel. Woo!